Okay, we will get started just a couple of minutes late. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's profit webinar, Crop Insurance Capstone, Critical Issues in Crop Insurance. This webinar is part of our Profit Risk Management series that includes webinars and in-person workshops focused on a variety of topics including food safety regulations, GAP certification, crop insurance, and risk management tools. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all the information you'll need to join any of the remaining trainings in this series. You'll also find the slideshow being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. I also invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com, where you'll find more information about the Profit series and links to past Profit webinars. Once today's presentation is done, I'll unmute the attendees and we'll have a brief Q&A. After the webinar software will prompt you to fill out an evaluation for this webinar. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we would appreciate it. This series is possible with support from the USDA Risk Management Agency and the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who have joined with the Farm Credit Council and Morse Marketing to offer this important series of workshops. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Gordon Killian, Vice President of Corporate Insurance Administration for Northwest Farm Credit Services, and Dean Benson, Senior Vice President of Corporate Insurance Services. Gordon was born and raised in the state of Washington on a dairy farm within the Columbia Basin Irrigation Project. His introduction to crop insurance was in 1998 when he was asked to join the Sloan Insurance Agency specializing in federal crop insurance. He worked as an agent partner until 2005 when the crop insurance portfolio was sold to Northwest Farm Credit Services. He has had many duties within the organization, including agent, regional vice president, and now VP of Corporate Insurance Administration. Dean Benson was the recipient of the 2015 National Crop Insurance Services Outstanding Service Award in recognition for outstanding service and outreach to small, limited resource, and socially disadvantaged farmers. Dean has been in crop insurance for 23 years and was an agency owner from 1999 to 2008, servicing policies in Washington and Oregon. He sold the agency in 2008 to Northwest Farm Credit Services, where he currently serves as the Senior Vice President for Corporate Insurance Services, working with 45 branch offices throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, promoting crop insurance risk management programs. Dean does not consider crop insurance agents as salesmen, but rather risk management consultants, tailoring the tools available to growers to best fit each individual's situation. Janie, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. I just wanted to say a few words to kind of kick us off, and then I'm going to shoot it over to Dean and Gordon. If you ask around, you'll quickly find out that Dean and Gordon and the Northwest Farm Credit Services offices are really the top-notch crop insurance folks out there, and not only because they care about the issues, but they're extremely knowledgeable about the particulars of how crop insurance works, and they just have a deep understanding of how people go about doing their own risk management analysis, but also the role crop insurance can play in stabilizing their farm and ranch enterprises. And so we're very excited that they agreed to be on this with us. But I also wanted you to know that if you go to our website, we also have some other resources that are available out there. We've got PowerPoint slide sets that talk about crop insurance for beginning farmers and ranchers. And some of the special ways that the crop insurance industry tries on folks who are just getting started or not that experienced in the food and agriculture arena. And we also got some PowerPoint slide sets that also talk about common myths and we're trying to bust myths occasionally here. because crop insurance has been around for a while, but it's changed a lot too, and it probably will continue to change as the risks for food production don't necessarily uh, get any easier to deal with every day. We've always got this exposure that to various types of risk, and it just helps all of us. We believe here at the initiative, if we take off the glasses and look at our enterprises with a really, careful eye about how to identify those risks, just surface them up, be very upfront about them, and prevent as many problems as we can, and plan for downtimes, but in a way that doesn't keep us in those downtimes. We literally, manage ourselves to keep on top of the risks that we know are inherent in food and agriculture, but can be dealt with over time with solid business plans, solid approaches to risk management, and solid approaches to the need for ongoing training in this whole area. So I just wanted to interject a little bit right before Dean and Gordon get started. Some of this can be complicated. That's why we're also doing these as webinars so people can, turn them on at home when it's dark outside and they're in for the night and continue to just kind of learn over time in a way that makes sense to you. So Dean and Gordon, please jump in here. We're thrilled as usual to work with you all. Y'all are the best, and we just and we trust what help you give us, and we hope this partnership keeps on and on. So Dean and Gordon, it's all yours.
All right. Well, Janie, I'll start off here. Thank you very much for that. We're excited about being a part of this. We do have a passion to help farmers and ranchers and educate them on what programs are available and how they can best establish a risk management program that works for their farming operation. So hopefully through what we're presenting today, and we'll get through some of the Q&A at the end, that we can help answer some questions as to what's available, how the programs work, and how farmers might be able to benefit from these. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gordon, who's going to have our first portion of the presentation here.
All right, thanks, Janie, for your comments, and Brian for putting this on, and Dean. We'll go ahead and jump right into this. For some of you that might have attended one of these we did a year or so ago, first little part of this presentation, we'll talk a little bit, some high basics, and some of the older products that are out there, the different variety of products. And then Dean will kind of concentrate on some of the newer stuff that's out, the WFRP program. But go ahead, Brian, let's move forward here. And yeah, go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to talk about the relationship that the federal government has in this crop insurance program. And this is a slide we'd used a while back, but it just kind of gives a general feel of the relationship between the private and the federal government. And so if you look back at the federal crop insurance program, it's been around a long time, but it's part of the USDA under their budget. And way back when this Federal Crop Insurance Corporation was organized, and this is the entity that really writes the policies. They oversee the program kind of on a federal level. And then we have our risk management agency who implements and interprets the policy language. They are highly involved in all the research and other aspects of creating crop insurance programs that will benefit the farmers nationwide. Then there's this relationship of this connection with the private industry. What we call AIPs, or approved insurance providers, and these are private companies who contract with the federal government to service the policies. They settle the claims, they work the underwriting, and really where the rubber meets the road as far as the relationship between the government and these policies. That relationship is they sign what we call an SRA, or the Standard Reinsurance Agreement. So that's the agreement that these private companies have with the federal government to run the program. And then this is where Dean and I, we come in, especially in our past life as agency owners and as agents, but these AIPs then are appointed, give appointments to various agencies and agents to service the product. And so it's really these agents and these agencies that have the one-on-one connection with the growers. They do the marketing and the servicing of the policies. And I'll just interject here for those that are listening that maybe don't have an insurance agent at this time and they're just looking at getting involved in crop insurance. It's really that those agents are the ones that you're going to really lean on to get the information you need and the service that you need in order to be involved in this program and to make it an effective risk management tool for you. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to find a competent agent that really his interest is your best interest and what works for you. Go ahead, Brian, let's advance. Go ahead, Dean.
Well, I'll just interject a little bit too, because as you look at these programs, there are many deadlines, there are lots of reporting requirements, and I think just to your point, it's like, you know, most customers really aren't, I mean, they're farming. They're doing their job, and to work with somebody that, you know, understands the programs, understands, you know, the reporting requirements and the deadlines involved, so that nothing slips through the cracks, so that you have the coverage in place that you wanted if and when there's a problem. That's just paramount, and I think it's really important to emphasize that. So again, a lot of detail that goes on behind the scenes. You know, I know agents as a whole try to make this process as easy as possible for producers, but there really truly, there's a lot of rules and regulations that are associated with this.
Great, thanks, Dean. Let's get right into some of the programs. Some of these have been around a long time, and this is just a brief description of them. We refer to a lot of the federal crop insurance programs as MPCI, or multi-peril crop insurance. And really what that means is these are policies that cover multiple risks that are out there, whether it be wind or hail or a myriad of other weather events. Unlike some of the private products that are out there that might only cover one peril, multi-peril does exactly what it describes. It covers multiple perils. And within that category, there are many choices on how to best protect your risk based on your needs. One of the things that's important to note is that a lot of these policies are based off your APH, your actual production history, and so this history is developed. Some products are a 5-year history, most of them are a 10-year history to come up with what your average production is. And we have a little example later to show how that comes into play. But some of the policies that are out there are yield protection, meaning that they're protecting a certain yield. They're going to guarantee you that you'll harvest a certain yield, and if you fall below that, then it would kick in and pay an indemnity. There's other products that are what we call RP, or revenue protection, which not only are based on an average yield, but also a projected price that has been established. And so if you fall behind either in yield, or maybe if that price is below what was projected, could potentially trigger an indemnity. And then you have products that are revenue protection, but there's a harvest price exclusion. I won't go into the detail of that, but it is a revenue product, and you have those options. And then fairly new in the program is these ARH programs, actual revenue history. So what these programs would do is take your average revenue for various crops, and cherries is one of the policies, and then create a guarantee, and then guarantee you so much revenue off that. So a little bit different than the RP in that it uses your actual receipts that you sell your product for, versus the RP, or the revenue protection, which uses an overall average harvest price to calculate those claims. There's also, for those folks that are in livestock or dairy, there's the LGM livestock gross margin policies that protect the gross margin. And then there's also the LRP, which is livestock risk protection. That's available in some areas for feeder cattle, fed cattle, and lambs. There's also a pasture rangeland forage policy, and then what we'll spend a little bit of time today talking about is the WFRP policy, which replaced the old AGR Light policy and has been around the last couple of years. We'll get into some detail. You know, in the description of this conference call or this WebEx, it talked about some of the old programs we'd touch on, but really want to concentrate on some of the newer programs, and that's why we're going to get into a little bit more detail on the WFRP. Obviously, a lot of these programs vary by location, and there's some additional programs that we didn't list in this slide. Some areas you have the stacks, you have the SCO, and some other programs, but we'll just leave it to what we have here. Wanted to go, this slide here, we're going to dissect the multi-peril policy just a little bit more, in that there's different levels of coverage that you can choose to do based on your tolerance for risk and what you really need to protect. The basic coverage that we call it catastrophic coverage, or the CAT policy. Here's a policy that you don't have a lot of options, but it's very inexpensive, and so this policy will base a guarantee based off of 50% of your average production over those last 5 or 10 years, as I described before. And each crop has an established price or an approved price that they'll pay if you have a loss, and the CAT coverage does limit that to 55% of that approved price. One of the other things, you only have 1 unit per crop per county, so all wheat, let's say, in a particular county will be adjusted as 1 big unit. The cost is $300 per crop per county. It doesn't matter how many acres you have or plant in that county. And the reality of it is the premium itself is 100% subsidized. The $300 is just a administration fee that's charged. So the CAP policy is subsidized 100%. One note that we wanted to make sure, as we talk about the whole farm revenue protection policy, you have to just understand that if you're going to have that policy, you're not eligible, or you cannot have a CAP policy. That will disqualify you from having a whole farm revenue protection. But if you're not involved in the whole farm revenue protection, the CAT coverage is an option. Buy-up coverage, and the best way to think of this is if you say CAT is the basic level of coverage, and then you can buy up from there, meaning that the premium subsidy is not 100%. You will pay a portion of the premium on buy-up coverages, and that varies depending on the level of coverage. But you have options, 5% increments, starting at 50% up to 75% of your actual production history. There are some counties, some commodities where you can even go to 80 and 85% level coverages. And you also can get 100% of the approved price if there's an indemnity to be paid. And one of the most important advantages of having a buy-up policy is you can qualify for what we call optional units. So best way to think of that is, instead of having all your wheat, for example, in the county insured as 1 big unit, you can actually have that wheat insured by units, which generally is by legal section. There's some other rules and guidelines you have to go by, but it really makes the policy more effective, and especially in capturing losses in smaller units, smaller areas. Go ahead, Brian. One of the things that we really have to emphasize, and not to paint this program as being too complicated, because it is fairly basic, but as Dean described earlier, there are a lot of deadlines. There's certain things and requirements as far as the reporting goes that you have to make sure you pay attention to, and we want to maybe just hit a few of those in a few slides here, just to emphasize this fact. So obviously with any program, you're going to have an application period of time. If you already have a policy, then you can renew that, make changes once a year, and there are deadlines based off of your area and the commodity and the program that you're involved in, so there are some deadlines there. I referred to a couple times already to the actual production history, and so there is a period of time where we have to collect that harvest data, and those records need to be from third party or maybe an appraisal by the approved insurance provider, but there has to be some verifiable records showing what your production was, and that is all compiled into what we call an APH. And then as the crop is planted, we have an acreage reporting date where we have to record what was planted and the location it was planted and the date that it was planted. And the movement in the last few years is to go to what we call CLU reporting, meaning that you're going to report that by a CLU number that's been established. A lot of the AIPs have created map-based reporting to help accomplish this task of doing CLU reporting. There are various ways to report it, but it does have to get down to that CLU level going forward. It used to be a little different in the past, so that's something that's new that needs to be talked about with agents and make sure you understand how that works. We also added here in this slide what we call accuracy, which is the program that's out there to allow growers to report their acres either through their crop insurance agent or through the FSA. Now, it does not eliminate the need for them to sign at both locations, but there is a sharing of data between FSA and the crop insurance companies. For our own purposes, we'd rather see you using your crop insurance agent to do that because it's a little bit more critical as far as the crop insurance goes to make sure that's accurate and reported correctly with your crop insurance agent. Other reporting, various crops, different programs might require you to keep records or have crop contracts that you submit. If you have organic crops that you're raising, you have to have certificates showing that it's certified organic. You have to report changes in your farming operations, any entity changes, anything like that. And just recently, starting last year, there has been a connection made between conservation compliance and crop insurance. And so there is a link there, and you have to make sure that you have reported to FSA the conservation part of this. And if you don't do that, if you fail to be in compliance, then you can lose your premium subsidies, which is a substantial amount and would increase the cost of your insurance pretty substantially. So it's very important to note that you have to be conservation compliant. And as was described before, there are deadlines that apply for each of these steps of the process. So it's very important that in this regulatory world that we live in and all the rules of this, you have to understand those. Go ahead, Brian. All right. Something else that's really important in crop insurance is how you report the entity. And it's the policyholders' requirements to make sure that they are filling out their applications correctly, that they're identifying their Social Security number or EIN or a RAN number, and that has to be done by the sales closing date. Also, every year, those numbers have to be verified and to make sure that they are correct. And if there's any changes in the entity type, those have to be reported. Very important when it comes to the running of this program, especially at claim time. You have to make sure that if it's an individual farming, that it's identified, or if it's a trust, partnership, corporation, they really need to be identified correctly. And you have to identify all the individuals that have at least or have 10% or more interest in that entity. The entity that insures the crop must have ownership in the crop. It seems to make a lot of sense, right? You can't insure something you don't have an ownership in, but that's something that you have to verify. Also, information reported to other federal agencies, including FSA, have to be right. And it doesn't say accuracy on here, but that's part of it too, is this: if you're going to report to FSA, it needs to be the same numbers, same information you're reporting to the crop insurance agencies. And for conservation compliance, the entity information must match the crop insurance policy. So just to reiterate and to emphasize that exactness in a lot of this reporting is very important. So go ahead. Claims reporting. So obviously you write a policy to protect for the risk that you might have, and if there's something that goes sideways on you in your farming operation, you want the claim process to be very seamless. And in order for that to happen, a lot of this reporting that we've talked about already needs to be accurate. So anything that's misreported information could impact your claim payments or void your coverage, which we don't ever want to have happen. So we want to make sure that everything's done right. It's important to report your acreage and production data accurately to avoid coverage or claim reductions, once again. And there's some deadlines on when you have to file claims, and so it's good to know those. In general, 72 hours after the discovery, no later than 15 days after the end of the insurance period. And there's some other dates for different products that, like I said, if you get involved in crop insurance or are now, visiting with a good, competent agent to make sure you understand those deadlines for claims reporting is very important. Go ahead, Brian. Okay, we have just a little bit of an example here, and we're only going to do an example for yield protection products. RP would work similar, although it would have a price component that would come into play. And then the WFRP, Dean will go over some examples with that. But just a simple example of how the federal crop insurance program works. And so we're going to make some assumptions in this, and this is a per acre example. So we're going to say that this grower has a 50 bushel per acre approved yield, meaning that we've taken his history over the last 10 years, or a minimum of 4 years, but we've gone through and calculated what the average is. And in this example, we're going to assume that the established price is $6 a bushel, which this year it seems to be trending a little lower than that. But anyway, let's use $6. So how do we calculate the guarantee? So if I have a 50 bushel APH, that's my average, and I choose the 85% level of coverage, and I have a 100% share, once I do that math in this example, I would have a yield guarantee of 42.5 bushel. And what does that mean? What that means is if I harvest less than 42.5, I'll get an indemnity of $6 per bushel less than that. So in my example, let's assume I harvested 35 bushel per acre. And so you look, that's a 7.5 bushel deficit from what my guarantee of 42.5 was. And so the calculation would be 7.5 bushel times that $6 established price, and I would receive $45 an acre for that deficit. So that's just a simple generic. I mean, really, if you know that sort of a formula, you pretty much know how the federal crop insurance works. And like I said, though, there are some variations on the different products, whether it's revenue or whether it's a yield-based. Go ahead, Brian. Just a couple more slides for me, but also I just wanted to point out that along with the federally subsidized programs that these AIPs offer and the agents offer, many agencies also offer private products. Now these would be private crop insurance products that are not subsidized by the federal government, and many of these policies only cover for 1 or 2 perils. Not the multi-peril like we described before on the federal side. So there's hail insurance available for most crops in most areas. You can buy fire and wind coverages only for a lot of small grains and other crops. There's winter kill programs out there if you lose a crop during the winter. Haystack fire. Some areas that have sweet corn, there's wind coverages. Plus there's many crops that have a replant coverages. And there's other private insurance coverages available depending on the location. So if you're looking at your total risk management of your farm, it would behoove a grower to not only look at the federally subsidized programs, but there might be some need to add some private products on there to maybe beef up certain coverages in areas that you feel like you need it. All right, Brian. One of the last things I wanted to talk about here is the importance of crop insurance. And, you know, we can talk about why it's important in your operation as far as tolerance for risk and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of world today that are changing, and I'm not going to get political as far as climate change, but there's no doubt that local weather events are going to impact your crop production and or quality more than any other cause, and to a large extent it's unpredictable, and even if we could predict it, we're largely unable to change its effects on that crop that year. So we all know this as farmers, that we're at the mercy of Mother Nature, and that is where most of the risk lies. More so in the last 10, 20 years or so, there is a global impacts too, that a weather event in some other part of the world could affect the economics of our of our operation, and it can influence the price based on the supply, whether it's a large supply or a short supply. So a lot of these factors that are out of our control, whether it be local weather and maybe weather that we're not used to in our area, or the global weather patterns and economics, can really add additional risk to our operation. So there are crop insurance options that address both the local and global climate impact. We talked about the yield protection and revenue protection. WFRP, this whole farm revenue protection, is a product that really gets down to the nuts and bolts of the dollar impact that either weather events or price can impact your operation. And so it's really important. The crop insurance it's vitally important to be looking at that and using that as your risk protection. And with that, we'll turn it over to Dean, and he'll talk a little bit more about the whole farm revenue protection policy. Dean.
All right. Well, thanks, Gordon. Great job. Nice overview on the federal programs and private programs that are out there available to us. Obviously, there's a lot of detail behind each and every one of those specific crop programs. I know here at Northwest Farm Credit, in the 4 states that we work in, we actually insure 42 different crops, and so each and every one of those has their own specific rules and specifications that we have to meet, and I think it's just important to kind of go out there and see what's available, and some of these various programs may work for your farming operation. One of the most important things I think that we've been kind of looking at the last number of years, Northwest Farm Credit has been involved in the AGR, or Adjusted Gross Revenue Program, AGR Lite, that came along a couple years later, since its inception. And really, truly, that program was designed to not only protect against the weather-related causes of loss, but also, like Gordon talked about, some of the economic impacts that can happen that are completely out of producers' control. So you could have your best crop ever, and production's wonderful, the quality is outstanding, but if everyone else has the same crop, maybe that supply and demand is going to reduce the value of the crop that you have, and in turn maybe kick in a loss on the revenue side. So those are some things that we want to talk about. I'll tell you, there's just been some unprecedented weather events that have happened globally and here in the United States. Most recently, I mean, they're talking about a 1,000-year flood event down south. It's like, when's the next one going to happen? Is it going to be 1,000 years, or is it going to be, in the next 5 years? We don't know. And that's the beauty of having these kind of risk protection programs available to us, because ultimately we don't have a crystal ball, and we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. So let's talk a little bit about whole farm revenue protection. What is it? It is it's a safety net that you can have this policy that really protects all the commodities growing under your farming entity. It's really, if you look at it as a umbrella policy, that it's looking at all your acres, all your production, all your revenue that you generate under under that farming entity with a single revenue trigger. So if you have multiple commodities, it could be one of them, does great, three of them don't do so great, and ultimately, if you fall below your revenue trigger, you could be in a claim situation. I have just a short, easy to understand example here where a producer that has a revenue trigger of $100,000 for that year, when the dust settles, all the income off of the crops came in at $85,000. And those could be weather-related causes, could be just some market issues that came into play. But at the end of the day, that's all the income they were able to generate. And so that left a $15,000 shortfall of their revenue trigger. And under the whole farm revenue program, that's paid out dollar for dollar. So that $15,000 would be the claim payment. Pretty easy to understand. Years ago, I remember a producer telling me, Dean, show me the money. Show me the money. That's what pays the bills. And if I don't have the income, whether it's from a weather-related cause or a revenue cause of loss, the bottom line is I can't pay the bills and I can't continue farming. So this program is really designed to look at multiple aspects of your farming operation and the revenue that you generate. So next slide, Brian. So what this map shows is the expansion of the whole farm revenue program and really kind of the utilization. Obviously, we're in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana up there in the northwest corner of the United States. This has been a very popular program for our producers, and one that we understand as an agency, and I think have done a very nice job getting out in front of our producers and explaining how the program works. But you can even see the shaded areas from 2015 to 2016 nationwide. And if we look at the national policies in 2015, there was 1,130 policies written. And for 2016, that nearly doubled at 2,215. So as agents and companies embrace this program and they understand it, and they can get out in front of producers and explain to them how the programs work, then I think there's going to be more and more producers that are gravitating towards to this whole farm revenue protection program. So you can see also, we do have a large concentration of these policies. The Northwest FCS or Northwest Farm Credit Services policy counts that we have, and some of our market shares is pretty high. And again, I believe it comes down to our understanding of the program and our ability to explain that to our producers so that they can, I guess, pick a risk management program that works best for them. So, but we're excited about this. We're moving in the right direction. We want this program to be successful for the long haul, and I think the way to do that is to really continuing to spread the risk nationwide and get more and more producers involved across the country so that if there is a problem in Florida and there's no problems in the Pacific Northwest, that those claims are paid, but the program becomes financially stable, and it just allows us to continue on for years to come. So as you can see with this slide, just some of the premium that has these are grower premiums that have been paid. 2014, that was under the AGR Light program, about 19 million total. Of course, when the first year of whole farm revenue came out, bumped up to almost 54 million. And now this year they're projecting over 120 million in total premium sales. So you can see how this has kind of taken off nationwide as more and more growers become familiar with it and how they can utilize this program to help protect their farming entities. Pretty significant growth. Again, like I talked about, spreading this risk over the entire nation is really important. Just allowing policies to be written, and where those issues pop up here and there, I think it's the #1 rule of insurance is spreading risk. And when you do that properly, then you can afford to keep the subsidies in place, you can allow this protection to be provided for all producers. So it's an important risk management tool for our specialty crop producers. And, I talk about, we have 42 different crop insurance programs available here in the Pacific Northwest. Well, I can tell you in Washington and Oregon, there are over 200 different crops growing. So there's a lot of crops that don't have an underlying program available to them, yet under this whole farm revenue protection program, all of those are insurable, regardless of size. It's an outstanding program that allows really truly every farming operation in the country to have a level of coverage. We work very closely with RMA to annually look at the program and see if there's some improvements that we can make, and with our companies. And I think they've been very receptive to listening to producers, the companies, and input that we've had to really strengthen the program. I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about how is this program put together? How does it work? Basically we're guaranteeing revenue, okay, and we're going to look at your 5-year revenue history and come up with an approved whole farm revenue. On this example here, we're showing, okay, we've done all the work behind the scenes, and then we're going to go over that in some detail as we get into this on how we got to this point. But we're saying, hey, this particular producer is going to have a approved whole farm revenue of $343,000. We look at their commodities that they're going to grow, and what's the expected revenue that they plan or hope to get off of those commodities, the acres that they're planting, and the value that they believe that those are going to be worth. And in this particular situation, we're saying, hey, if everything goes right, we should be able to generate $356,000 in total income. So then we say, okay, what coverage level or what income trigger level do we want to establish on our farm? And this particular one, they're saying, hey, 80% coverage level is what they want to look at. And so you look at both the approved revenue and the expected, and we have to take the lower of the two to establish this income trigger. So 80% of the $343,000 is the $204,000. So that becomes now the income trigger or the income floor for this farming operation. I think it's important to note that they're also looking at the input costs. This producer is going, it's going to cost me, total input costs are about $270,000. So at the end of the day, I need to generate that amount of income just to pay the bills. And if I can guarantee an income trigger of $274,000, at that point now I'm able to pay my bills. I'll be able to continue farming next year if a situation happens that my income drops below that. So very, very important way to kind of look at the program. A lot of folks ask, hey, what does this program cost? How is it subsidized? The subsidy levels are very high. Looking at this particular example, that $274,000 of income trigger, the whole farm revenue cost would be about $1,900, $1,992. We are also looking at the underlying crops. In some cases, you want to put the underlying coverage or the MPCI program in place for a couple reasons. One, you get a liability credit towards your whole farm that helps reduce the cost on the whole farm revenue piece of this. But also, for some of those underlying coverages, you're still going to get your unit structure. So if you have a loss on one location and all the others do great, you can still get paid a loss on that multi-peril coverage, even though maybe your whole farm revenue isn't triggering a loss or your other production policies aren't triggering losses. It's more some spot coverage that you would have available. So there's some benefits. We can, when we evaluate your whole farm revenue program, we'll look at, with and without the multi-peril coverage and how that comes into play. What does that do for your annual cost? But in this example, we're saying, hey, the grower went ahead and signed up for some underlying crops at the 60% level. Premium on those was $1,800. So at the end of the day, on this particular policy, premium was about $3,800. You know, that equates out to a 1.38% premium rate, which is extremely low. This makes this very, very affordable for growers with a lot of coverage available and just a whole number of things that are covered as part of this program. So again, you know, this liability or coverage to premium ratio is very appealing. It's extremely affordable. There's a lot of factors that come into play on this, depending on the number of commodities you have and what those commodities are, whether there's an underlying program or not, can really come into play on what your premium rates are. But all of that, you know, we just run quotes and examples to show you how that works. It's available now in all counties in the U.S. They did increase the liability limit from the old AGR policy, so it's now at $8.5 million of total coverage or liability that's available. And again, depending on the coverage level that you take, I mean, that could mean that you're at a, you know, some of the high-end folks could be at a $10 million or $11 million total, you know, gross revenue. That then, depending on their coverage level, if it's 10 million, you do an 85% coverage level, you get it down to 8.5 million, you're insurable. We've got to keep that liability at 8.5 million or below to be eligible. One of the things they changed for 2016 was increasing the expanded operations. It used to be, if you were buying new ground or, you know, adding you know, acres that are coming into production, depending on your farming operation, I think the first year out, it was at a 10% maximum for expanding operations. They increased that to 35%. So then we look at your straight line averages. Hey, it's an expanding operation. You've added some new ground. You've got new commodities coming into production. You know, working with the companies the AIPs, we can actually increase that straight line average up to 35% now to accommodate those expanding operations. So that's a big plus. On the claim payment side, under the old AGR program, you know, you used to have different payment rates, and it could be 90% or 75% on the dollar. Under whole farm revenue, it is dollar for dollar. So 100%, if you drop below your revenue trigger, it's going to pay you dollar for everything short. So it's a 100% payment rate. So that's a very nice option and a welcomed change in the program. You know, to be eligible for whole farm revenue, same rules apply that Gordon talked about. You know, you have to be eligible to receive other federal benefits. You have to be a U.S. citizen. One of the most important things is you got to file either a Schedule F tax form or other tax form that can be converted to a schedule, a substitute Schedule F, so that we can, you know, pull the income and expense numbers off of that form. And it's really that you know, that's something that's just required. You know, not all revenue counts, not all expenses count. We need to be able to see those tax forms to be able to tell exactly which numbers we need to be utilizing. You have to have at least 5 consecutive years of farm tax history. So really, truly, you have to go back 6 years because you have to have filed those taxes for 5 years. The current year that you're in is really, we call it a lag year. And so you haven't filed yet, but you're farming, so we're going to do the 5 previous years. If you're a new and beginning farmer, you may qualify for less. You have to have at least 3 years of tax filing that you've done, and then the current year, you know, you have to have been farming, and then we'll look at the next year as far as your projections go. So there are some different rules that apply to new and beginning farmers, and just check with your agent to see if you qualify for those. Again, $8.5 million in insured revenue, which is the farm revenue allowed insured under the policy. And again, that revenue, your actual revenue multiplied by the coverage level, is really what's going to establish what that liability amount is. So some important notes here. You can't have more than 50% of your total revenue derived from commodities that are purchased for resale. So it's really set up for you as a producer producing those crops. If you exceed this rule, you're going to be ineligible. You have to have buy-up levels of coverage or no coverage at all on your other crop programs. You cannot have a cat coverage, as Gordon talked about previously. If you have a cat policy, those need to either be canceled or changed to a level of buy-up, or you will be disqualified from having whole farm revenue. So really important point as we kind of get started on the 2017 sales and sign-up period is that if you have a cat policy in place today, you're going to have to make a decision. Is it better for me to buy up a level and take advantage of the liability credit that I can get for that policy and apply it towards my whole farm to help reduce the cost of your whole farm? Or is it better to just cancel that cat policy and sign up for whole farm revenue? So those are some decisions that as producers you're going to have to make, but understand that having a cat policy is going to be an immediate disqualifier for you. You have to meet some diversification requirements. When you look at the different commodities that you're raising, if they have a revenue protection program as part of their what's available under the underlying coverage, let's just use wheat as an example. So if you did a RP, revenue protection policy for your wheat, and that was the only commodity you had, then you're not going to be eligible for whole farm. So you need to have at least 2 crops or 2 qualifying crops if you have revenue protection policies on those. So that's something your agent can work with you on. You need to take a look at it, but the idea is that if you already have a single commodity and you already have a revenue program as part of that, then they're not going to qualify you for whole farm. So we need to get some additional crops, need to break those crops out if there's some different ways we can do that to qualify you. When it comes to potatoes, is another one I just wanted to make sure we pointed out, is that there's some specific rules for potatoes that say you can't be 100% potato producer. I think what is it, Gordon, cut off at like 86%. If of your revenue is from potatoes, then you're going to be, or more, you're going to be exempt from the program. So
that's correct, yeah.
For insurability, there's this whole list of crops that are on the list by county, by state, that are established on the whole farm revenue list. But truly, it's any agricultural product established or produced on the farm. There are some exceptions: timber, forest and forest products, animals for sport, show, or pets. If you've got revenue that you're deriving from any of those, you're not going to qualify for whole farm. But pretty much everything else. Now, they have to be, federally legal commodities as well. So just make sure we touch on that. But those are the exceptions. Other than that, there's a lot of crops that are showing on those county and state lists, and then there's a big category called all other. And unless you fall under one of these exemptions, you've got coverage available under this program. So under whole farm, you can have coverage levels that range from 50% up to 85%. To qualify for the 80 and 85% levels, you must have 3 or more qualifying commodities. The chart that I'm showing here is really to kind of lay out, how those qualifying commodities work. It's also important to understand that the number of qualifying commodities gives you a premium rate factor that'll reduce your costs. So they're saying, hey, the more crops you're growing, we're going to give you a factor that's going to allow the premium you pay to be subsidized even more. But you can see, if you have one commodity, you're 100%. in order to qualify for 2 commodities, that second commodity has to produce at least 16.65% of the projected income. In order to have 3 commodities, that third commodity or combination of commodities below that has to equal 11.1%. At that point, if you have, let's say you have multiple commodities and your first 2 are fine, that third commodity or commodities, so they're going to combine. If you have 7 different commodities and those bottom 4 equal 11.1% of your projected revenue, that will qualify as a third commodity. And at that point, if you want, you can qualify for the 80 or 85% coverage level. So it's just kind of important to see how this all works, and as you're working with an agent, trying to determine what coverage levels you can qualify for, how the rate factors come into play. Okay. Talked about the Schedule Fs, and this is just a little copy of one. Again, we're going to look at the revenue side of this and see what pieces of revenue we can count as we look at establishing your 5-year history. Gross revenue from farming commodities excluding added value post-production costs. So again, we're going to be looking at the expense side of things. Expenses that are directly related to the production of the commodity is what we're wanting to include. And so there's a number of line items there that you'll have expenses as part of your farming operation that we won't be using. So it's really making sure that at the end of the day, when we're working on a claim and they're trying to establish what's the revenue to count, what are the expenses that we have to count, that we're all on the same page and counting the same figures, and everything's working out the way it's supposed to. One of the things that you have to keep in mind on the allowable expenses is that we're going to show this in a little bit, but you're going to have an expense trigger. And so as we establish that expense trigger, it's important to understand that if you don't meet those expenses, and it could be for some reason a storm hits and you're not going to, and maybe harvest costs are a big part of your expenses. If you drop below 70% of your approved expenses, then they're going to start reducing the income guarantee as well, and just kind of offset that because you didn't spend the money. Now they're going to make some adjustments on that. So we'll show that to you in just a bit as we look at some of the other examples. But again, important that you have the Schedule F and or substitute Schedule F so that we can pull the correct revenue and expense figures to establish your policy. This is just an example looking at a typical farm, showing the 5 years of revenue, 5 years of expenses, and this is going to change annually as we add a year. As we get ready for this next year, we're not going to be using 2009 through 13, but we'll be upgrading that, taking off the 2009 year, adding in 14 or adding in 15, and just adjusting that to a 5-year history. So it just every year it's going to change, and that mix of crop years is going to change. And what we're trying to show here also is that you can see there's an average revenue of $165,000 on this particular farm. We've got a number in there for expanding operations. That could go up to 1.35% depending on the farm. We also have what's called an indexed revenue. The indexed revenue is really looking at that 5-year farming revenue history and going, what's going on this farm? And in this particular one, and we've done this to an extreme, but we're showing each and every year they're increasing their revenue. What they're actually reporting as revenue and paying taxes on has gone up. So it's showing that this farming operation just continues to grow. And it could be you've got trees coming into production that's increasing that. You could be adding more land. There's lots of different factors that come into play as to why your income's increasing. But if that's what's going on and that's continuing to grow, we're going to look at this indexed revenue as something to compare to your projected revenue. And And this one here, this is kind of maxing it out here, but that straight line average of 165,000 has now indexed up to 343,000. We're going to be able to look at that 343,000 as compared to what you're projecting your income to be, and go from there. We're doing the same thing over on the expense side. Those expenses are ratcheting up as well as that farming operation begins to grow. So rather than using a straight line expense average, we're going to have to factor those up as well. So go on to the next slide, Brian. So this then looks at the intended farm operations report, and really what this is as we're looking to set the coverage, we're saying, okay, what do we plan on growing next year? In this particular scenario, we're looking at potatoes, alfalfa, and wheat. We've got our acres in there, our projected yields, total production, and then what is the price per unit? Potatoes, we're looking at hundredweight, so $6.25. And what's that projected revenue? Okay, in this particular case, those potatoes, we got to take a good hard look at those, make sure it's within the guidelines that we have for the potato coverage, which it's well within at 33.74% of the total projected revenue. Now we've got our alfalfa projected 140,000, and the wheat coming in at 96,000 for a total projected revenue for these three commodities of 356,000. So now we compare that to that indexed revenue that we had on the previous page of the 343,000, and we say, okay, between those two, now we can only insure or have our insurance come off of the lower of those two figures. So if that indexed value in this case is a little bit below what the expected revenue is, that's the one we're going to have to use. So that 343,000 now becomes our approved revenue. Okay, Brian, let's go to the next page and we'll show you how this comes into play. So now we've got our approved revenue of 343,000, and you can see all these different coverage levels that this particular farming operation has available to them. We've highlighted the 80% level because that's what we used in the previous example. So that gives us an income trigger. 80% of 343,000 is 274,000. So that now becomes the revenue trigger, or the, some people call it the revenue floor. If your revenue drops below that, it's going to pay out at dollar for dollar for anything short. We talked about the expense trigger. So remember, this was the factored up expenses. So now we're at 205,000. 70% of that becomes your allowable expenses. So it's the same for all coverage levels. It's 143,970 in this example. So that would be your expense trigger. So again, that comes into play at claim time, and as long as your expenses exceed that 143,970 in this example, there's no adjustments whatsoever. You've put your sprays and all your input costs are included in that. As long as you've exceeded that, it doesn't impact things one bit. But in some cases, harvest becomes a huge part of the expense, and if you don't harvest, that could come into play. Okay. So here we talk about this income trigger, 274,000. What is the whole farm revenue part of this policy cost? And this goes back to our premiums again. And I think it's important to note on this slide here is the different coverage levels and kind of how the subsidy pieces work and this premium. So you can see at the 80% level, the one that we've highlighted at 1992, if you wanted to take it to 85% level, you certainly could, but your premium's doubling. If you wanted to pull it back to 75% level, if you felt 257,000 was adequate, then you could insure at that level, and your premium's going to drop $900. So it's, again, you get to pick and choose what works best for your farming operation. If you don't have underlying MPCI policies, so the first example there, we're giving you the liability credit, which reduces your cost. if you just had, hey, we don't have any MPCI policies, maybe there's nothing available, or we've just opted not to insure them under the underlying programs, the MPCI programs, your cost on this would be, $3,800. So again, you just have to take a look at that and see what options work best for you, but you need to make those decisions kind of in tandem with your whole farm revenue, and look at it as a package deal for what risk management programs you're putting together and how it might work best for you. Understanding why they give you the liability credit under the underlying coverage is that what they're going to do is settle those claims first. So if you have a production policy in place and you had a production loss on a particular crop, they're going to look at the claim on that, and anything that's paid under that policy is going to be revenue to count. So that's going to add into your harvest and sold revenue that you had on the commodities, and so that's going to add revenue on your total crop year, and so if you're still short of your revenue trigger on the whole farm, now it's going to pay you the difference, but it's not going to pay you twice. It's going to pay under the MPCI coverage if there's a loss there, and then add that into your total revenue and compare that to your revenue trigger, and then pay you the difference. So they give you a credit for that because you've got that coverage in place, but they're also going to count the revenue. So it's really important to understand that. When it comes to claims, there are some, we call them tripwires, you just got to be aware of. And it's important to, if you have an issue, let's say there's a storm, frost, a freeze, a hailstorm, something that could impact your crop, it could impact the revenue, or anything else that just may impact the revenue on your commodities. When you discover that, you need to let your agent know so they can get a potential claim notice turned in to the companies, so that they can get an adjuster assigned, and we'll start working with you directly on what's going on. And it could be that it's a we're just waiting. We're waiting for you to sell the commodities. We're waiting for harvest to finish. We're waiting for you to file your taxes. There's lots of things that come into play, but putting them on notice gives the companies an opportunity, if they need to go do field inspections and just walk you through, any of the scenarios that can come into play, as far as if you were going to abandon a crop because now it wasn't economically feasible. You've got to get permission from them to do that. So it's really important that you're in contact with your agent's in contact with your adjuster, and you should be hearing from an adjuster within a few days of when you report it to your agency, in most cases. And if you're not, you follow up. There is a deadline that you have to report. You can't report a loss later than 60 days after you file your taxes. So if you normally file March 15th, you've got to make sure you're turning that claim in before May 15th. If it was June 15th and you go, oh man, now I got my revenue and I'm coming up short, you're beyond the window of opportunity for reporting a potential loss. So you've got to be looking at these commodities. You've got to be looking at your harvest, be looking at your estimates, making sure that if you're going to file your taxes, that you made a well-informed decision if you're turning in a loss or not. When in doubt, we say turn in a loss. Worst thing that can happen is they have to deny it or cancel it if you're not in a claim. So just be aware of that, be proactive on it, put it on your calendar, and don't let that lapse. Claims are settled after the taxes are filed for the insurance year. They're going to accrue a value of the crop revenue for that year. They're going to exclude any revenue from crops grown in previous years. They're going to include value of crops that were harvested but not sold. So if you have something in storage that hasn't been sold yet, they're going to have to put a value on that. And they're going to put a value on any unharvested crops if that's applicable. It could be that you have a very light crop and you don't feel it's worth harvesting, But if the crop is a viable crop and it has value, they can put some value on that. So you need to work with your company, your adjusters, to kind of look at that and see if there is some value that has to be reported there. And then again, they're going to be counting any claim payments from the MPCI policies as revenue to count as part of the claim process. Okay. It's just a little kind of a diagram that shows kind of a calendar, whole farm revenue coverage. For a calendar year filer, it's going to attach January 1st. And so you have until March 15th. That's the absolute deadline to sign up for whole farm revenue. A lot of our producers will be signing up, in September, October, November, and December this year for next year's coverage. They just go ahead and do it as part of their application process, and they get the coverage in place early. It attaches January 1, so that if something happens starting January 1st, they've got coverage in place, whether it's a weather-related cause of loss or something starts happening on the market side. They've really been able to ensure that entire calendar year. And again, fiscal year filers, there's some different rules apply, but you'll need to work with your agent on that. But this is a great example that just shows, hey, January 1 coverage can start. Okay, if you didn't apply till January 30th, okay, coverage isn't going to attach for 10 days after that application. And so again, now you're looking at February 10th, and if something happened in that 10-day kind of waiting period, you could be without coverage. So we like getting folks in, getting them signed up early, having that coverage attached as soon as possible so that there's no issues there. But you do have until March 15th. That is the absolute deadline. So then weather-related causes. We could have hailstorms or drought or excess rain or moisture that creates some quality problems. Whatever it might be on that side of it can impact your production. It can impact your revenue. So again, if you have an MPCI policy in place, those claim settlements are going to be done probably before the end of the year. Generally speaking, those are completed after harvest, and those claims are settled in October, November, first part of December. So that piece of the puzzle is done. That any claim payments there could be revenue to count towards your whole farm revenue. Then we got to wait until after the first of the year when you file your taxes, and then start working with the company to settle your whole farm revenue claim. And generally speaking, those are done, within 60 days of you filing your taxes. Again, it's on a case by case and working with your company to get those completed, but that's kind of the timeline. So it's a little more than a year through the process. It takes a little longer to settle whole farm revenue claims because we do have to wait for those taxes to be filed, versus the MPCI claims. Okay. So again, as we looked at that policy that we used for an example, and we had that $274,000 revenue trigger, when the dust settled on this particular year, the producer only had $200,000 of total revenue to count of all the commodities that we valued. And so they were $74,000 short of their revenue trigger, and in turn were paid a claim for that amount under the whole farm revenue program. So again, just an example of how this program is designed to work. And I think that's kind of it. Brian, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. We'll go ahead. Go ahead.
Brian, before you go on, I've got a question for Brian, for Gordon or Dean. And Dean, I think you're still on.
Yeah.
Right? This is Janie, and I just wanted to kind of put an exclamation point. Crop insurance is a wonderful addition to the risk management portfolio. It's none of it is going to be perfect at any one given time to make somebody whole. But could you comment for a minute, just if you would, about and if you won't, then I will, about the reluctance of Congress to actually start entertaining disaster bills again, because I think that that's an important piece of the history behind crop insurance, that people just got to know and understand that we're in a different scenario than we used to be, say, 20 years ago. Could you comment about that?
Oh, absolutely, because I'll tell you, when I first started 23 years ago, there was, there were ad hoc disasters that seemed to occur every year. And it's like, I think a lot of growers just kind of sat back and said, if something happens, the federal government's going to step in and they're going to allocate some funds in my area, and I'm going to be able to get paid a claim. And I think for the most part, that has gone away. The federal government truly has said these risk management programs that we are heavily subsidizing are what's available for producers today. And the ad hoc disaster is, for the most part, a thing of the past. It has gone away with the expectation that farmers have this available to them, and they need to be taking advantage of it and getting signed up, because they're not going to be there for ad hoc relief in the future. And we've seen it in other areas too. I mean, more and more, the federal government is, just eliminating some of the payment programs and things that used to be available through the FSA office. It's like more and more folks are having to stand, just truly on their own farming operation and what's available through these risk management programs.
Well, and thank you for weighing in on that, Dean, because it really behooves then to not think that you're still functioning in a world of 20, 25 years ago, number one, but also it behooves you to really start to understand, if you don't understand these programs yet, start to get some experience with them, start to understand how they interface with your operation, and quite frankly, start to understand where there's gaps, because Congress and Risk Management Agency can't really do anything about the gaps if nobody's talking about the gaps, right? And so when we see that there's pieces of the puzzle that need to be kind of shored up or thought about in a different way, it helps us as farmers and ranchers if we're involved in these enough to know our stuff, right? And really be able to speak with clarity about what could or might be necessary to provide some safety net, for our producers. So, I just wanted to make those kind of points a part of this, because I agree with you. I cannot see Congress going back anytime soon or ever to the world that we knew 25 years ago, where disaster bills happened every year. I don't see it happening ever.
No.
And so the sooner we all kind of come to terms with that and really sink in and get to know these programs and really understand them, and they're complicated. It's insurance. It's not simple, right?
You're right on, and I'll tell you, here's the thing, and we're trying to figure out a way, Jamie, within our customer base, how we can get the word out, because there are a lot of great people in Congress, and I think these programs are well established and have good support, but there's always there are folks that are trying to do whatever they can, it seems like, to eliminate some of these risk management programs. And I'll tell you, we've got to just make sure our producers are aware when this legislation's introduced, and that grassroots effort to be able to call your congressman and say, hey, do no harm to crop insurance. We need these programs. We need, Mother Nature can be wicked, and we are out here investing a lot of dollars and in a heartbeat. I mean, I saw a hailstorm come through a few years ago and literally took out a 300-acre apple orchard, and the grower lost $5 million in 5 minutes. If they didn't have crop insurance, they were out of business, okay? So when folks are out there, just kind of hammering on the federal crop insurance program and the subsidies and some of the things that are, instrumental in providing this service to our producers. Producers need to be aware of that and need to voice their opinion on the value of these. So I just think keeping informed, keeping involved, you know, helping to keep these programs viable is extremely important.
Right, and you know, we don't talk amongst ourselves as often as we should in Indian country, but I know many, many tribes who have operations, really a lot of tribal producers who participate every year in crop insurance programs because it's just a risk management tool to their investment, and it's necessary. And I was reminded of this again yesterday. You just gave your story about hail in 5 minutes, and one of the producers here in Arkansas was on a panel yesterday with me, and he was talking about losing, you know, millions of dollars in his produce operation, totally family owned, happened overnight, inundated with water. So.
Yeah.
You know, I hate to always to hear of those things, and the other thing I'll tell you is crop insurance won't always make you whole, but it'll keep you in the game, right?
Yep.
So, anyway, so I just wanted us to dialogue for a minute about those because I think those kinds of little tidbits about why we're even doing this at all are really, you know, pretty important to talk about. And I'll thank you again, both of you and Gordon, to participate with us today. Your insight and your assistance is always so appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Our pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Janie. And with that, we'll go into our question and answer portion. We've got about 20 people in attendance right now. So rather than unmute everyone and create a cacophony of background noise, what I will ask our attendees to do is if you have a question, you can either raise your hand, and you'll see an option for that in your control panel, or you can type your question into the question box, and it will come to me, and then I will read your question to our presenters, and they can answer it. So it looks like Amy Coffey has got her hand raised. Is that right? But it looks like Amy is muted. So Amy, if you're able to unmute yourself, I can come back to you. I did have Steve Carlson, looks like, sent a question, and it is this adjusted yearly to change with farm size? And he's referring to the whole farm revenue program.
Oh yes, absolutely. So every year, you know, we're going to look at, you know, the most current 5 years of tax returns. So that was one of the, when we looked at the Schedule Fs, you know, you're going to have 1 year drop off, you're going to have a new year add in. We're also going to look at your projections for the new year and whether or not you qualify for an expanded operation or an indexed average. So yeah, the numbers change every year, and some years it's going to make sense, some years it might not, just depending on that history and what we're able to utilize. So no, it's an annually changing and updating program that really looks at your farming operation. So
Can I add something to that too before you go into the next question, Brian?
Sure.
And you, Dean and Gordon talked about it too. Records, 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 records. I mean, you can't say it often enough. It's going to be that indicator of the level of insurance you carry, but it's also going to be central to proving your loss and everything. And so just the importance of understanding, number one, that your record-keeping practices are the backbone of your participation in crop insurance or really any other thing. The other piece of this puzzle, too, that I think people forget sometimes is that you're entering into a contractual relationship, and as such, you've got some pretty specific duties and requirements that you have to meet. Record-keeping is a part of it, but also, you know, advising people of your loss on a timely basis, and just you've got to read your policy.
Good points, Janie.
Okay, I've got another question that came in, and it says, in the past, what has helped with various outreach efforts for farmers to understand and realize these benefits?
Well, maybe Jenny, you can probably answer this too a little bit, but I know for our purposes, we conduct in our particular area out here, we'll probably hold 25 in our 4 states, probably 25 to 30 different grower meetings that specifically talk about some of the programs that are available. But most specifically, as part of each of those, we're talking about whole farm revenue and how this might come into play. So we are out there, really inviting anybody and everybody to come attend these, learn more about the programs, because you really can't make an informed decision on what works for you and your farming operation until you understand it. And education is key. But I don't know if there's RMA does some training sessions, and they do grants for folks to provide training sessions. So how we get that word out and how folks become aware of where those are and how they might come into play. Probably the best person to answer that. So
I'm going to jump in here. I really, if you had asked that, if whoever asked that had asked me that 15 years ago, I probably would have had a different answer now. And given how busy everybody is, I just, every producer I know is up to their eyeballs with way too much going on in their lives and way too much going on in their operations. And I'm just finding it more and more difficult to literally carve out time for people, not me personally, because that's all we do is go around and try to do training sessions. But it's just hard. It's harder today than it was, 15, 20 years ago to carve out the time to stay with it. And that's why I think, reaching people through webinars that can be archived, that people can listen to 1,000 times with the, with the slides, that's an important tool. Knowing and being aware, and maybe you've never been to, for instance, one of Farm Credit's sessions in your region, but it's time you stopped that and showed up for a session, right? I mean, these things are really, really important, and so availing yourself of opportunities when they arise is really important. Having access to stored materials, like we're trying to develop a large library of very detailed, stuff like this for people to use when they have time. But the other piece of this puzzle to me is that and Dan and Gordon, you probably do this more than anybody I know, but we're missing the depth. We're missing we're missing having people literally sit and walk you through and dialogue with you personally about what makes sense for you, because you're dealing with some very private information about your business and your finances and what makes sense for you. You don't want to do that, particularly in a wide open, training session with 30 other people there, right? And so I'm not sure, Dean and Gordon, how we solve that last problem, which is, my feeling is we just simply don't have enough warm bodies out there who can do that one-on-one. And that's why, going back to what you said, and start talking as a producer to crop insurance people who sell these for a living, and start walking through these kinds of very personal financial issues with them, because you're going to have to get to that granular level at some point.
Well, I completely agree with you, and I'll tell you, the group meetings that we have are like what we've done today. I mean, they are not going to get into a specific farming operations nuts and bolts of what's going on, and people don't want to do that in a group setting. So our folks, I mean, and I think nationwide, there are agents out here that are becoming more and more, especially when it comes to whole farm revenue, informed on how this program works. But if you were to reach out to an agent, I don't care where, if you're in South Carolina or New York, and you find an agent or somebody that you've been working with and just start asking around. Is this a program that you're familiar with? If not, do you know somebody that is? Seek them out, and you're going to have a one-on-one personal visit with them, and they're going to tell you what documents you need to bring in and what, how the program works, and run some quotes and some scenarios to show you coverage and cost. I mean, it gets real personal, and I know that's what our agency does. We've developed quoting tools and things that really allow our growers to see in a very short period of time, what the different income and expense triggers are, so that they can make an informed decision on what coverage level works for them. But you got to sit with somebody that understands it, or seek out somebody that understands it, so that you can learn from them. And you've got to take that responsibility on yourself. And RMA has a nice agent locator piece as part of their website, where you can dial in and see who's licensed in your particular area. That's a good starting point. Or talk to a neighbor, talk to a friend, talk to other producers in the area, and find out who they're working with, and if they're pleased with the knowledge and service that they're receiving, and then seek those individuals out.
All right, thank you. We have a hand raised. John, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Great program. As you kind of indicated, I mean, the momentum for more of these policies, whole farm policies being done is, growing, exponentially. That said, who would, and I guess maybe for some agents that are just dabbling into this, I'm in North Carolina, and I can tell you, I had a client that, had a long-standing relationship with his insurance agent. His agent told him he was not eligible for whole farm because he indeed had a CAP program. That producer left that agent, went to another agent who wrote him the policy and told him he was covered. So I guess my question in that scenario, where would ultimate liability or responsibility lie? Here's a producer thinking all year long, he's covered, and God forbid if he's got to file a claim and finds out he's not. I guess again, so my question would the carrier ultimately through their checks and balances look to see that there was a CAP policy and let him know that he wasn't eligible?
Yes, I mean they what they'll do is as long as they're the same tax ID number, I mean they're going to be able to run that sort and see if they have another policy. But what we run into sometimes is that there's multiple insurance carriers out there, and you could have your underlying coverage with one person and your whole farm revenue with somebody else. And if I'm aware that you have a CAT policy, it's my obligation to tell you, sorry, you don't qualify. I don't care if it's with another agent. I don't care if it's with another company. You're not going to qualify, and at the end of the day, you're not going to have coverage available to you. So I don't know what I mean. The first guy told him right, okay, and that company that has the whole farm revenue policy, I think ultimately would find out that there's a CAT policy out there if it was somebody else, but I can't guarantee that, and it may not be discovered until claim time, and that's when it would be null and void. So it's kind of you want to be dealing with one person. We like having both sides of the equation, knowing that what the whole farm revenue, the underlying coverages, how those come into play, because you also want to be plugging in that liability credit. So you want to make sure they're getting credit for that. Those claims are going to have to be settled first so that you can count that revenue. All of that comes into play. And if it's not till claim time, that's going to be kind of a rude awakening. If they go, well, you have a CAT policy, now we're null and void. And that's kind of scary, but that's reality. So
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, John. This is Janie. I'm going to tell you, something you probably already know, and that, I would have told somebody 35 years ago. The best person to know to know what's going on is the producer themselves. And do you know what I mean? And to have that producer with enough working walk around knowledge of these programs and how they work, so that when you run into something like you just described, that all sorts of bells and whistles go off in that producer's head. It's not just I want to go find coverage. It's I got to know enough about this so that I know if somebody's telling me the wrong thing or not, right? And you don't want to inadvertently walk yourself into a problem. And I know that sounds trite, but 35 years of doing this, the best risk managers for producers are the producers themselves.
Just might want to say also, these programs do change occasionally. And just to your example of the CAT policy, the old AGR program, you could have a CAT policy. But when it shifted to WFRP, they changed that rule. And then in the first year of it, I think partway through, Dean, didn't they make an exception for the early fall crops? You could have a CAT policy. So back to your scenario, if we're talking 2015, it could have been an agent saying, well, you can't have it, and then the other agent said, well, you can. Well, it could have been because of that exception for that 1 year. But my point is this, is that there are rule changes as it goes along, and back to your comment, Janie, you're exactly right. I mean, the producers have to stay abreast of this and really continue to learn. I don't see working with an insurance agent any different than a grower would work with his field man, or maybe his fertilizer guy, or maybe his accountant and his lawyer, in how they set up their entities and run their operation. They need to have that same sort of relationship with their crop insurance agent. It's that important.
All right, thank you. We do have, let's see, Shelley, it looks like you had a comment. Do you want to offer that? Shelley, are you there? I think we got a pretty bad connection. We are barely hearing you. All right, I don't know if any of the presenters could hear that. I certainly could not. Shelley, I'll just go ahead and read what you wrote, and I'm going to mute you again. Shelley wrote, RMA RO can come out and give presentations to producers and groups if they want on RMA programs and what's new and what is out there for producers.
Yes. This is Janie.
Yeah, I would
and don't forget to call on RMA itself. They've got great people who work for the agency, and that we need all hands on deck most of the time. It's not just enough for somebody like our initiative. We got to have RMA itself. We got to have the Gordons and Deans of the world. I mean, there's just, producers are far flung like they always have been. We just got to all kind of lean on each other to get these words out.
Well, I think it's important to know too, I mean, the companies, we work with 6 different companies at our agency here, and all of them will and have participated in grower meetings and grower education webinars, and they're an active player in this role too. So you're right, it's a team effort. You're going to hear something from somebody, one presentation, that you might not hear from somebody else, and it's like, try to get your info from more than one source.
All right, we have, let's see, just a comment from Danny who says, very informative webinar. Thank you, Danny.
That's what we like to hear.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions from our group, so unless our presenters have anything additional.
No, just thank everybody for participating, and thank Dean and Gordon for, as always, being such incredible partners to this work.
Our pleasure.
Thanks
Thanks
for inviting
very much.
us.
Yep. Have a good afternoon.
Yes, thank you. And with that, we will go ahead and close out today's webinar. And I'd just like to remind our audience that this webinar and the other webinars that we have already conducted in the Profit Series are available on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. Thank you for joining us.